great banquet. So it's about a wealthy person who hosts a banquet, and he invites all of his wealthy friends, but they make a lot of excuses for why they can't come. And so the host turns around and he invites the poor and the crippled and the blind and the lame to come to his banquet. And after he's done that, there's actually still room for more guests at his banquet. So then he just invites pretty much anyone off the street to come in and share in this great meal. And so we talked quite a bit about the message of this parable last week. Jesus is teaching us here that those we may least expect to reject God's invitation of eternal life may actually end up rejecting it, while at the same time, those we may least expect to accept that invitation might actually accept it. But the key to being part of this banquet, the key to eternal life, is genuine response to the invitation. Not just looking the part of someone that we might expect to be at the heavenly banquet, not just looking the part of someone who we would expect to live eternally, but genuine response to the invitation. And then after the dinner scene is over, Jesus continues on his way to Jerusalem with crowds accompanying him on the road. And Luke records Jesus here setting a very high standard for being a genuine disciple, for being a genuine follower of him. And it's a standard that sounds intimidating. It may even sound impossible to us at first, and so we talked about it last week. Jesus says that we must hate even those closest to us to be his followers. And we talked about how in the context of everything that's going on in Luke and just in the context of Jesus' ministry, hate here doesn't mean literally hate, like have no love for someone or despise someone, but loving someone less than God, loving someone less than Jesus. In other words, the Lord needs to be our highest priority. And this is a display, this is an instance of how we take up our own crosses to follow Jesus. Taking up the cross represents sacrificing everything for Jesus, even as Jesus, of course, will go on to sacrifice himself for us. And then Jesus gives us some illustrations showing that we need to understand this level of commitment before we undertake trying to follow him. We need to count the cost, is a phrase Jesus uses here. We need to count the cost of following Jesus. Otherwise, if we don't do that, then when push comes to shove and our faithfulness is put to the test, we may discover that we're unwilling to follow through and truly be his disciple. So that's where we made it last time. That's where we stopped. So what I'd like us to do is finish up chapter 14. There's still a few verses left, and then move into chapter 15. So you may have noticed a pattern as we've studied Luke and as we've looked at Jesus' teachings, a pattern in the way Jesus teaches, especially when he's teaching parables, where the last statement that Jesus gives often expresses the principle that is at the foundation for the entire teaching. And the same thing happens here in this teaching that we were looking at last week, but we didn't get to that final sentence. We didn't get to that last statement. So I'd like us to look at verse 33. At the end of everything Jesus has said here, he says, "So therefore, any of you who does not renounce all that he has cannot be my disciple." All right, so a lot like last week, when we first read this probably sounds like an unthinkably high standard, especially when it's read out of context. And we talked quite a bit about the importance of reading things in context last week. So out of context, if we just looked at verse 33 and that's all we had, it sounds like we have to abandon every single last possession, relationship, responsibility. We just have to drop all of that in order to follow Jesus. We just have to walk away from it all if we want to follow him. Now, in context, if we can recall everything we were talking about last week, Jesus' teaching makes a little more sense, but it still remains very challenging. So renouncing all that we have would be another expression of bearing our own crosses, right? Just like hating father and mother and all that stuff last week was an expression of how to take up our crosses as well. And Jesus' disciples, they would actually continue to have possessions. They would continue to have close relationships even as they followed him. So The Apostle Peter, for example, he had a wife. And when we move into the book of Acts, we see that, which is, of course, Luke's second volume, we see that the early Christians, they owned homes, they sometimes ran businesses, they had families. So when we put this in context, Jesus is not telling us to just immediately throw everything away if we want to follow him, but he is teaching us to be ready and to be willing to deny ourselves these things and be ready and willing to deny ourselves these relationships if at any point they become obstacles to following him. And we talked some last week about how incredibly difficult that would be, especially when thinking about walking away from family members. When loved ones are involved, that would very likely, that whole process would probably involve some hurt feelings, maybe some bad blood that would linger for maybe a lifetime. It may involve some exclusion and some shame. But Jesus is calling us to be devoted to him above anyone and anything else in life, and that will take sacrifice. And without that kind of devotion, Jesus says, we cannot truly be his disciples. Any questions or comments on verse 33, or really this whole teaching that we've looked at this morning and last week before we keep going? Bob, let me get the microphone to you.
We talk about context.
Yeah.
I want to go back to Genesis 12, Abraham. God told Abraham to move out, leave his possession, leave his family, and go to a place where he's never been before. And we come to Luke. Luke's telling us as well to forsake everything, our 401ks, our 403bs, our Roth IRAs. How many of us would do that?
Yeah.
So we talk about context. We have to realize that if we put those possessions before God, then that's a hindrance from us to move forward.
Yeah. I appreciate you drawing in the example of Abraham. He's a great Old Testament example of someone who was called to take a big step of faith, big leap of faith, and leave everything behind. Doesn't actually even know where he's going, Hebrews tells us. That's a great example, Bob. Thank you.